The hollow lit like a prayer in the dim bar, a woman's face, bruised but steady, eyes that still held the diplomat's quiet. Her image stuttered with static, her voice remained unbroken. If you see this, Elara said, they lied about peace. They called it progress. They were wrong. Silence dropped, less pity than the superstition humans carried through space. Rain beat the roof. 2 small feet made wet sounds on the plank as 2 girls stepped inside. One held a cracked data pad, the other hugged a cloth bag that jingled with coins older than many systems. 8 and 10, patchcoats on thin shoulders. The older's cheek bore a bruise like a hand-shaped accusation. Kids, the bartender rasped, 6 eyes blinking unevenly. Outpost 37 don't do charity. We're not here for charity, the older girl said. We're here to hire someone. A trader at a corner table snorted. With sandwich crumbs and bedtime stories? This is a joke. The younger girl set the bag down with care. It whispered metal. Older silver, she said. And our mother's name. The name slid through the room like a current. The Glaren stopped polishing. Heads turned to the shadowed booth where a man sat alone, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, coat dark with rain. A ceramic teacup steamed between gloved hands. He had the stillness of someone who could let a room fill with noise and then bend it into order. They rarely spoke his given name. He was the legend people told to hush children. The older girl spoke the nickname softly. Baba Yaga. He tightened around the teacup but did not rise. When he looked, his eyes were gray and precise. Let them speak, he said, voice soft and edged. The older placed the cracked pad on the table. The younger pushed the coins beside it and folded her small hands. They stood straight. Their smallness made the request sharper. You sure? The bartender warned. Legends aren't for hire. We were told to find you, the older said. Mother said someone would. She said you taught her how to keep mercy sharp. Ivan, the name she used in the recording, regarded them as he might regard a map. He rested his teacup on the wood and reached into his coat. For a breath he was another man, fingers quick and exact. He took the coin the younger had offered and examined it, not as currency but as testimony. It was old minting, a woman's face worn smooth and letters barely legible, YGA. He set it back beside the pad and then, of his own accord, produced a second silver coin from his pocket and placed it on top. Not payment, a token. They turned the pad. Elara's hologram ran longer now, a diplomat's uniform faint beneath bruises, a face that had bargained for peace and been broken on live feed. They beat me on broadcast, she said. They harvested what makes us human. Project Harvester. They turned feeling into a tool. She looked straight into the light. Ivan, she said, never forgive what you plan to forgive. Remember for me. Ivan handled the pad like a relic and watched the rain smear the outpost lights. He placed a calloused thumb on the coin at the pad's edge, as if testing a pulse through metal. The gesture was small and private. You're asking for blood, he said. You understand what you ask? We want them sorry, the younger replied. Her words were small and true. Eat. Ivan's voice was plain. Revenge waits. Hunger doesn't. The bartender set 2 plates with hands that shook, tuber stew, thick and hot. The girls ate like people afraid the world might reclaim it. Around them, conversation resumed in low clusters. Someone muttered, He's real. At the edge of the room, a trader whispered about Harvester and Diplomat's files. Ivan listened more to the way the girls ate than to the gossip. He noted how the younger hummed a lullaby between bites, a fragment of a song the mother had once sung, perhaps. That tiny melody lodged in his chest. They used her work to build something else, the older said between spoonfuls. Project Harvester was supposed to stop wars. They turned it into control. Ivan's hands went still under his coat. He had once walked away from this kind of work because the cost never left you. Now the hinge closed, not because he wanted vengeance, but because the ledger of harms had been opened wider than a single death. You taught her? He asked, quiet. She said you showed her how to keep Mercy sharp enough to survive, the girl answered. Her voice did not waver. Outside, a dead Imperial Channel spat static into life. A terse bulletin cut the air, code name, Harvester. Status, active. Ivan set the teacup down with a slow, certain motion. He rose and drew his coat around him. He carried the look of a man who had practiced leaving and learned the route. It was a promise tailored to small hands and small grief. For a sliver of a second he saw her again, not the hologram but the woman who had argued for talk over artillery, who once pressed his palm and said, "Keep Mercy like a blade. Hone it, do not dull it on the world's edges." That lesson had bent him as much as any wound. He had walked away because the ledger of consequences was too long. Now a new column had been opened and could not be ignored. At the docks the Clementine waited, a patched freighter that coughed and hummed like an old animal. Its ramp was half lowered, a single lantern tossing light across wet metal. He had a ship, a plan, and two small reasons not to quit. They followed him into the rain. Neon smeared like bleeding ink across the docks. The bar slid back into murmurs and smoke. The bartender wiped his palms and mouthed a prayer for something smaller than empire, for the girl's safety. Ivan paused at the threshold and glanced again at the pad with its 2 coins, memory and mirror. He did not take them. This job began with remembering. Possession would wait. As they vanished into the storm, Alara's last voice folded into the air like a command. They hurt something they don't understand. The Clementine smelled of oil and old stars as it descended through Kilo's ash. The planet chewed at the hull, grit that stung and clouds the color of rust. Ivan guided by feel. The girls watched the viewport, eyes wide at a world that had cost them everything. The ramp thudded to the market's patchwork. Kilo's 9 was made of scrap and barter, plates of hull welded into stalls, tarps lashed over engines, neon signs repaired with copper wire. Merchants hawked algae slabs, soldered baubles, and genuine souvenirs stamped with faded human logos. The 2 girls followed Ivan's long coat like small shadows. The older kept a hand over the coin in her sleeve as if it might tumble away. "Keep close," he said. "Smile when you can." At a relic stall Ivan stopped to mend a cracked toaster with a pocket knife. The seller, an old woman with one brass hand, blinked and then laughed when the appliance sputtered heat. The girls giggled, brief and surprised. Ivan had learned to make small repairs. He kept that habit. It kept the world stitchable. They threaded through alleys where a sign promised "Genuine Earth Echo, no returns." Behind a pulp curtain a broker's den hummed, scented of oil and old deals. The broker, translucent and many-fingered, flicked its masked eyes to the coin before it settled. When the broker asked for payment, Ivan set 2 ceramic cups between them and brewed tea. Courtesy bought answers in places credits could not. "You bring ghosts?" it asked. "Not for sale," Ivan said. "For leak. Fragments move differently." A thin strip slid across the table. Empathy_protocol.beta glowed faint. A manifest flagged Diplomat, Alara. A node read OFF World Archive. "They moved Harvester months ago," the broker said. "Fragments linger in detainment drives. Admiral Kess Thorin celebrates on a private run, careless with guests." Ivan did not offer credits. He offered patience. The creature obliged with coordinates, a rough schedule, and 2 blurred images, Thorin laughing beneath a Harvester banner. Its final line was a civic kind of warning. "Invoke the name and someone will bill you for the echo." Back aboard, Ivan woke the Clementine's drone. It rose like a small patient eye and painted back the mooring, service craft in rotation, tenders moving in clockwork arcs, the yacht's deck set like an island of light. Thorin's grin flickered across the console, a captured arrogance. They set up in a rusted hangar and ran the files until they stacked like indictments. MEMExtract.log, response archive, subject experiments. The clips were clinical, restraints, panels mapping emotional response, charts reducing grief to scalars. This was programmatic cruelty, not a single monstrous act. "Why harvest feeling?" the older asked at dusk, the question small enough to float in the rafters. Ivan listened to the kettle hiss. If sorrow can be measured, it can be modeled. If modeled, it can be predicted. Predictability is currency. He did not dress the truth. The younger hummed their mother's lullaby. The sound threaded the hanger into something less sharp. They needed tools. Ivan scavenged a depot plate, a scratch transponder to mimic service queries, a maintenance tag worn thin. He taught the older to strip a wire and read sensor glow. A dim blink meant standby, steady blue lock. The lesson steadied her. Purpose replaced panic. The market, for all its barter, was a tinderbox. Mercenaries, armored, efficient, bounty markers on their rigs, cut through stalls. Someone had placed a price on Ivan's head. They moved like a storm. Ivan did what he had always done in storms. He choreographed. A flash grenade arced to a precise point, disorienting one squad. A sweep unbalanced another. A blade to a throat stopped a third before it fired. No slaughter, only clean rupture. The girls huddled behind a crate. The older's knuckles whitened around the coin. From a fallen merc, Ivan eased the comm open. Its log blinked. Bounty increased. BY unknown. The net had tightened beyond rumor. When the dust settled, the drone returned with a file that chilled the hangar, an audio clip, dry and administrative. Human envoy experiment, success. Empathy pattern scheduled for phased deployment. The bureaucratic voice translated intention into decree. Ivan poured water over leaves and watched steam stitch the dark. He placed the cup before each girl and said, plain and steady, "We do not rush. We strike when the weave is right." They layered thin blankets and slept in a triangle by the brazier. The younger mumbled lullaby fragments. The older stared until the coin's face flashed in the brazier's light. Ivan traced routes on a folding map, approach vectors, rotation windows, maintenance cycles. He circled a path where service drones would yield a predictable blind spot. Maps, he thought, were promises you could hold. Before the first light, he rehearsed contingencies. He had the older repeat spoof codes until her fingers found the rhythm. The younger learned to hear the micro-stutter of an infrared sweep. They practiced slipping the depot plate between transponder pings. They tested the false transponder until the signals sat snug among service chatter. Ivan checked batteries, sealed spare packs in a lunchbox, folded the depot plate into a wrench cavity. Precision, he told them, is mercy. Waste nothing, spare as many as you can. He thumbed the coin the older had shown him and felt the warm woman's face under his touch. Alara's hollow whispered a line he could not forget, never threaten what you plan to forgive. It had the weight of accounting. Now forgiveness had been twisted into an instrument. They would have to return it to its intent. Outside, ash kept falling in a thin, steady sheet. Inside, 3 people bent over a schematic and the low hum of the Clementine. They were readying themselves to step into the teeth of an empire. They rode the Clementine into the ring of light that crowned the Dominion, a slow approach between platforms like teeth. The crown rose from the planet like an argument, arcs of glass and lattice, terraces stacked in ceremonial order. From below it glittered benign, up close it was a machine polished to arrogance. Ivan watched the orbital feed in silence, tracing turrets and transit ducts with a finger, as if drafting a map across the air. He outlined a path where maintenance routes intersected service bays, corridors designed for carts and cleaners, not soldiers. Those seams, he decided, were the ones he would use. "Why so many portraits?" the older girl whispered, eyes fixed on a gallery of admiral images scrolling past the viewport. "For a crown," he said. "You need decoration that convinces people the rest is inevitable." He did not sound bitter, he sounded factual. They masked the Clementine's signature and drifted into a service loop. The docking procedure was bureaucratic theater, transponder pings, identity handshakes, a perfunctory scan. Ivan fed their forged maintenance plates into the queue and watched for the brief window when the systems cycled diagnostic loops. He had done this when the world had more respect for treaties than terror. Muscle memory hummed through him like an old song. Inside, the station smelled of hotter metal and recycled air. Portraits of alien admirals smiled down from alcoves. At one end of the hall, a human plaque sat tarnished, the face nearly erased. Ivan paused at that plaque with something like reverence. He cleaned a smear with the hem of his coat. The older girl reached up and traced the carved letters, Ambassador Alara, Peace Accord Initiative. Someone had scrawled traitor beneath it in a clumsy hand. The sight tightened her jaw. They moved through maintenance shafts that breathed like sleeping animals. The younger learned to silence her breaths. The older learned where footsteps thunked hollow. Ivan taught them how to slide past sensor mouths by reading the rhythm of their blinking lights. A steady bloom meant sleep. A slow pulsing meant sweep. He showed them how to tuck an access plate into a pocket, and how to fold a wrench into a jacket seam so it did not clink. When they reached the command wing, the air changed. It felt like walking into a room that had rehearsed its sense of self for centuries. The staff officers were lacquered with pomp. The carpeting seemed to swallow footfalls intended to be loud. At the center of this theater sat Admiral Cuss Thorin, as smug as the brokers had shown, scaled armor glinting under chandelier lights, a harvester's sigil discreet on his lapel. He held court over a circle of admirers. Ivan stepped into the light without swagger. He let the room react to him and found the silence he expected. Thorin laughed as if surprised theater had an encore. "You made yourself comfortable," Thorin said, raising a glass. "A myth in a coat. Came to confess?" "I came to remind," Ivan replied. His voice folded itself small to the room and sharp at the edges. "You've been busy. I see a new instrument of civility." Thorin smiled, indulgent. "We refine what we inherit. Empathy is a lever. Harvester ensures stability." He gestured to screens where graphs ran like tidy rivers. "We make life predictable. No surprises. That's control," Ivan said. "Predictable doesn't make it right." Guests shifted. One reached for a baton before remembering the rules. Thorin's amusement hardened into a blade of condescension. "You sentimentalize chaos," he said. "Or you sell it as romance. Either way, you are a relic." Words mattered less than the next moments. The Admiral's hand moved toward a guard. Ivan did not wait to be in argument. He moved like someone who had long ago learned the shortest syllables of violence. A step, a toss, the press of a blade across a throat that took a breath and then stopped. The room unspooled into bright, short violence. Lights, a shattered glass, a body slumping. When it ended, Thorin's face was pale and furious rather than smug. He had not expected an old man to be this quick. "You killed him?" the older whispered later, after the skirmish in the wing fizzled into stunned officers retreating to report. Her hands trembled. "No," Ivan said. "He volunteered when he reached for what he could not control." The words were blunt but not cruel. Ivan's hands were already at the console. He had stripped keys and harvested terminal privileges in the minute that followed, like a man gathering evidence before burying a body. Files spilled into his drive, mem extract.log, subject responses, protocol iterations. The footage was clinical: detainees in soft restraints, panels mapping spikes of grief, modules that siphoned recorded effect. It was precise as a ledger and cold as a vault. They found the harvester chamber below the wing. It looked like a chapel gone wrong: glass booths, arrays of velvet-lined receptors, screens that pulsed not with news but with someone's private screams reduced to data points. In one terminal, a chain of code translated sobs into scalar values, then into predictive models. The room smelled like bleach and silence. "It's not about learning to forgive," the older said, voice barely audible. "It's about making us teachable." Ivan loaded copies onto a small drive and then did something that felt ceremonial. He took the Diplomat's coin and an auxiliary memchip and set them together. The coin's worn face fit against the drive like a key in a lock. He did not explain the mechanism. He only worked with a focus that turned the dim room into a chapel of intent. "This will make them see," he said. He palmed a small transmitter, an ordinary teacup-shaped housing he had hollowed and altered earlier, the motif that had been his private joke and now his tool. "We use the Crown's own network. Truth is a louder signal than propaganda if you feed it into the right channels." The younger's eyes widened. "You mean?" "We broadcast," Ivan said simply. "Across the network. Every screen. Everyone watches. Her face stacked questions, hurt, fear, wonder. Will they understand? Will they change? They will feel, he answered. Feeling forces decisions. It does not tidy itself afterward. That is the risk. He gave the admission like a tax due. He rigged the transmitter into the Crown's master feed with hands that did not tremble. Lines of code met the memdrive. The system accepted the packet because it bore the Crown's own signature spoofed by his earlier maintenance pass. The teacup housing clicked into place. It was small and stupid-looking to anyone who hadn't seen a war made of rituals. Sirens began to thread through the chamber, distant, then nearer. A sweep had caught a maintenance airframe misaligned. Their window was closing faster than the schedules had suggested. Ivan tipped a finger against the coin, feeling the worn metal like a heartbeat. You can still pull us, the older said. Run. Take the proof and go. He looked at the two girls who had asked the world to remember their mother. For a long breath he thought of Alara's last words, never threaten what you plan to forgive. That injunction had always been a fulcrum beneath his actions. He had wielded mercy in ways that became weapons before. No, he said. We do this now. The resolve in him was not triumph, but a ledger balanced on a different axis, truth as an instrument. Alarms swelled into the command wing. Footsteps thundered. The three of them moved like a single thing, two small reasons and an old man with a teacup-turned detonator. They slipped toward the broadcast panel, carrying a truth the Crown had tried to file away. Outside, the Dominion's towers poured light into the void, unaware the story they had edited against would soon reroute into every home and hand. The panel accepted the packet without argument. For a single heartbeat the Crown's nervous system treated the input as housekeeping, a maintenance ping, a routine update. Then the screens shifted. Where propaganda had painted smiling arcs and orderly triumph, a woman's bruised face filled every surface. Alara's voice came through like an accusation and a prayer all at once. They took me because they wanted what I felt. They called it progress. The feed snapped to clips, velvet-lined booths, sensors mapping sobs into scalers, officers laughing over graphs. Footage scrolled, labels, timestamps, MEM extract logs, each frame a ledger entry turned public. In the command wing, crystal-faced dignitaries who lived by their ceremonies blinked in disbelief. On distant platforms, households tuned the morning feed and stopped. A father in a dormitory dropped his tool. A child on a mining barge tilted a head toward a screen they'd only seen state messages on. Across the network a single raw fact carried like an ember: someone had turned human sorrow into machinery. The Crown responded with noise. Alarms keened. The Palace AI, the choir that had reinforced order with dulcet bells, stuttered as foreign packets flooded its buffers. Protocols cascaded into emergency mode. The Emperor's voice, ancient and carved, boomed over internal channels. Identify the breach. Seal the network. Ivan did not wait for the theater of their reaction. He had a second instrument, a small revolver, its cylinder packed with a single unusual round. The round did not carry lead but memory, a memdrive shaped into a slug, encrypted with Alara's voice, the harvester files, and a braided record of victims' sensations. It was an ugly piece of tech grafted into ordnance because the Crown had insisted its defenses be kinetic. The truth would ride in a bullet. Outside the Crown, the judicator answered the order. The dreadnought loomed into position like an accusation given weight, a cathedral of guns that had once kept worlds obedient. Its targeting arcs found the spire, and weapons' power climbed toward a quake. Ivan raised the revolver and took a breath meant to settle more than aim. He fired. The memdrive round struck the judicator's sensor array, a bright, small eruption of circuitry and light. The hit did not destroy the ship. It delivered a payload that spilled through the network, raw human memory as an invasive packet, not binary code but narrated sensation. Where it touched, recordings unfolded in the brains and interfaces of those aboard, a child's plea, an ambassador's last laugh, the wet sound of a hand slapping a woman who had only ever offered treaties. On the dreadnought's bridge the first officer screamed and then began to weep without knowing why. A gun captain swore and staggered, fingers hovering uselessly over a firing switch while a memory of a mother's hand on a fevered brow pressed behind his eyes. Men and women who had never been children felt, in the space of a breath, the thing they had spent careers denying, another's pain. Reactions multiplied, messy and human. Some crew dropped weapons and muttered apologies to absent faces. Others panicked and lashed out, firing blindly into corridors they no longer recognized. The Judicator's targeting faltered, then its engines stuttered. Power rerouted as operators fought against feelings they had not consented to. On the crown decks, officers staggered and then shouted orders in tremulous voices. Some refused to execute commands that suddenly felt obscene. The effect was not a neat repentance. In one docking bay, a squad that had been poised to shoot refugees began to cry. By the maintenance shaft, an officer went mad with rage and opened fire. The mendrive had pried open a truth many had been taught to numb. The outcome split along fragile human seams. Below, on platforms and in quarters, people watched the world they'd been fed dissolve into testimony. Workers stopped. Streets stilled. In plazas, citizens lifted their hands to cover the state crest that had once comforted them. In other sectors, the Crown's loyalists lashed back, patrols cracked down on gatherings, and in some places reprisals spilled into violence. Revolution and revenge, pity and retaliation, each ignited from the same spark. Ivan shepherded the two girls through smoke and shuttered corridors toward the escape lift. The older clutched the coin until the metal warmed to her palm. Behind them, the Crown's order buckled but did not vanish. Alarms flared in rhythms of grief and command. The Clementine's retrieval beacon pulsed like a heartbeat into the void. "Will they stop?" the younger asked, voice small against the howl. "They'll remember," Ivan said. Memory did not erase the past. It rearranged how people counted debts. Some will change. Others will fight even harder. That's the cost. They launched as the spire's glass exploded in a bloom of light, shards catching the stars like a sudden constellation. Screens across the Empire looped Alara's plea, the footage of Harvester, then a looping overlay Ivan had assembled, names, faces, timestamps, proof in tidy sequence. The broadcast did not disappear when the Crown tried to choke the network. Copies lived in 1,000 caches and 1,000,000 devices. The truth had become distributed. On worlds downlinking the feed, reactions were immediate and divergent. In one palace, a delegate wept and told a servant to stop singing the Crown anthem. In a factory, a shift leader threw down his tool and walked out. In other places, angry mobs burned banners, and military governors sealed zones. The shock rolled like a storm with no single predictable pattern. When the lift jettisoned them into open sky, Ivan did not smile. Exhaust and gravity pulled at his face. He handed the older girl the second silver coin, one he had kept. "Keep it," he said. "Not to kill. To remember what we do and why." She closed her fingers around the metal. "Will you come with us?" she asked. He looked at the stars, at the smear of light where the Crown had been, at the faces that now knew the cost of their ruler's calculations. "I don't belong where there are comfortable endings," he answered. "I belong where stories need finishing." The Clementine cleared the Crown's gravity well. Below, the fires of revolt and reprisal threaded the planet like a network of sore places. The broadcast continued to ripple outward through back channels and pirate relays. Whistleblowers and private feeds mirrored the files until the original signal was a rumor with weight. In the aftermath, there would be committees and tribunals, denials and bizarre defenses. Some officers would claim contamination of sensors, others would insist on a cyber attack. The Empire would try to digest what had happened and serve up explanations for the frightened and the faithful. In the cabin, the two girls slept against one another, soot on their faces and ash in their hair. Ivan watched them until the rails hummed their private lullaby. He thought of Alara's last message, her insistence that mercy be sharpened, not blunted, and felt that the lesson had been taken into a harder light. Across a dozen worlds, the phrase, born in the hum of a transmitted truth, began to be repeated in whispers, in shouting, in the hush of small rooms, something like counsel and something like threat. People said it at first with doubt, then with recognition. "Be kind. Be deadly, it said, and in that paradox the galaxy found an answer that was not comfort, but a charge.